So I just wanted to put that on the record so that we wouldn't have any delays later on.
Okay. So I don't. Okay.
Okay.
So I don't know if you all have looked at it yet.
I've had investigator look at it, Your Honor. I haven't had time to look at it. I told Mr. Hernandez I'd look at it this weekend, but it's rank hearsay. The whole thing is rank hearsay. But the case law talks about the parties being able to rebut or have an opportunity to rebut.
Okay, we're not getting into this right now. Okay?
That's fine.
Move along. Let's go. All right, bring the jury.
Okay, we're all set. All rise, jury entering.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Have a seat. Statement may continue.
Good afternoon, Dr. Downs.
Good afternoon.
A couple things I wanted to clear up. We've talked about veins and we've talked about vessels. Are those the same things or different things?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Veins and vessels, are they the same things or different things?
Vessels is generic for either an artery or a vein. A vein is a type of vessel.
And you touched upon the amounts of forces that it would take for to compress veins, arteries, an airway, and then the vertebral artery.
Yes, ma'am.
In this case, what is your opinion as to what was compressed?
The vein was compressed. The carotid artery was not at some point. It may have been compressed, but at some point the vein was compressed and the carotid artery was not.
And the vein, we're talking about the jugular vein?
That's correct. And I should also, since we talked about the others, the airway was not compressed and the vertebral artery was not compressed.
Are veins not as robust as arteries, or is that not a fair or accurate statement?
What do you mean by robust?
As strong, or is one more important than the other in the body?
Well, you have to have both. The artery wall has more muscular, more elastic tissue. The vein has a much thinner wall, so theoretically more fragile, more easily the wall could be torn. So if you put the two side by side and applied force to the vein to the point that it breaks, you'd expect the artery to remain intact.
And is that why it takes less compression or force is needed to injure the veins versus the arteries?
No, there's lower blood pressure on the vein side because everything is pumping out. The heart's got to drive the blood throughout the entire body into the tissues. From there, the veins drain back, and that's a more passive process within the blood vessel. There's just less pressure there.
Okay. So you reviewed the numerous photographs of the autopsy in this case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Looking at the full, almost the full body of the victim in this case, again, do we see a lot of the artifact on the flat surfaces that are more elevated than maybe others where we see this artifact?
Yes, as you can see in the photograph, the whole face, with the exception of the areas that I mentioned before lunch, around the eyes and the nose, those are more recessed. That is, they're not in the same plane, they're set back a little bit. The best example of that, look at her belly button. You see that same area where the skin surface is scraped away, that abrasion. But her very shallow belly button, maybe a 1/4 inch, is visibly undamaged. And you see that in multiple areas. Her armpits, the surface where it's sticking out has some artifact, but the crease does not. Her legs, the insides of her thighs, you've got a couple, but then the gap where the crease is between the legs and the genital area, there's nothing.
Does the scraping on her skin also continue down her thighs and her legs?
Yes.
On this photograph, does this photograph mainly depict artifact, or do you see any external injury on this photograph?
Everything that I see here, I would attribute to artifacts.
Moving on, can you explain what specifically we're looking at here and whether or not any injury is documented on these photographs?
This is the right, as you're looking, it's as though you were looking at Felicia. Her right eye is on our left, her left eye is on our right. And there is a eyelid retractor that's been placed in to open her eyes so you can really see the whites of her eyes well. And you see the little blood vessels here. That's the arteries joining the veins. The capillaries are in there. And the little red dots, those are the particular pinpoint bleeds. This scale down here is a centimeter scale. So from the 2 to the 3, that black line there, that's 1 centimeter. So these are a millimeter or less. And then some are bigger. That's where I said they're not really technically petechial, but they're the same thing. They just came together. So there's extensive bleeding from that capillary rupture, both in the right eye as well as in the left eye.
And is that, again, caused by, your example was the overflowing, the blood could not flow as it needed to, so it caused the petechial bleeds when the veins were compressed?
That's right. Mine's a crude example, but I think it makes it understandable. It's got no place to go, so it goes out.
Can you explain what body part this is?
This is the heart, so immediately in the middle of this picture would be the breastbone. The edges of the ribs on the left side are visible here. This is the heart that's taking up most of the picture. The sac that the heart sits in has been removed so that you can actually see the surface of the heart. And again, you'll see these bleeds scattered all along the surface of the heart. Those are the petechial, the intrathoracic or inside the chest bleeds that I mentioned earlier. And in addition, over here, this gray is the sac that the heart sits in. Outside that sac, between the heart and the breastbone, is the thymus gland, lymphatic organ. That edge of that is right here. It's all this pink stuff. And you can see dark areas of bleeding on the thymic surface. There were also documented bleeds on the surface of the thymus at autopsy.
How are these bleeds caused in this area?
Again, this is a related but different process. The lungs are kept expanded by negative pressure. That means the vacuum inside the chest. So if you were to punch a hole in the side of the rib cage, your lung would collapse because it's held open by a vacuum. What happens is, if you're struggling to breathe, you put pressure on the blood within the blood vessels inside, and the capillaries there rupture. So it's a little different process. It's a different mechanism, but the end result's the same thing. That is these pinpoint bleeds.
And these pinpoint bleeds, specifically in this epicardium and the thymus area, are caused by consistent with manual strangulation. Is that correct?
They are consistent but not diagnostic of. Again, this is a non-specific finding. This doesn't prove or disprove strangulation. It's a very common finding in strangulation.
As we go further, are there items or injuries that you saw that do in fact point directly to manual strangulation?
Yes, actually, if you go back to strangulation in general, because you can also see it with ligatures or ropes around the neck, belts, that kind of thing. The hemorrhages in the whites of the eyes. That is a finding that you see in strangulation, either manual or ligature. And then internally, we're going to see some more findings that are more indicative of manual strangulation. That is the hemorrhages in the neck that we've already touched on. The hemorrhages in the temporalis muscles. Those are different types of asphyxiation, strangulation predominantly, and that could be either a ligature or manual.
And since you talked about ligature, did you observe any ligature marks on the body or surrounding the neck area of Felicia Williams in this case?
I did not. A ligature mark would be, for example, if I took a rope and strangled somebody with a rope. The imprint of the rope will oftentimes be left on the neck. We call that a ligature mark. There was nothing like that. There's no indication here that a ligature was used at all. And in fact, if a ligature were used, I would expect a different pattern of bleeding than what I see. So in other words, I've excluded ligature from my examination. I'm left with my findings with manual strangulation.
Doctor, can you describe what part of the body we are seeing here, and if you can point out things within the photograph on the body that correlate us to what we're exactly looking at?
We're looking at her body. She's on her back. We're looking at the upper part of her body. Breast level would be about where the ruler is. This is the right side. The right ear area would be where I'm indicating at the far left of the picture. The right shoulder would be here. The left shoulder would be here. The sternocleidomastoid muscle, that's that big first muscle, if you remember, that went from the bony part to the breastbone and the collarbone. That is right here going down to the breastbone. Same thing on the other side here. And this is a close-up of that same photograph, same area, showing bleeding into the soft tissues underneath the skin. The way this picture's been taken is when we do an autopsy, make an incision between the shoulders down to the front of the chest. Dissect that skin from underneath and then literally take that skin. So I would have this flap of skin, dissect underneath it, then I would take that and flip it up. That's what we're seeing here. So in the example I just used, this is the skin flap, dissected, and then flipped up like that.
And Steve, he's referencing photographs. Are we identifying those for the record as far as what he's looking at when he's discussing this with the jury?
All the photographs, Judge, actually have the number below, and they are also included in our autopsy photographs with the number below.
Okay, so at some point, I just think for record purposes, that is there a way just to identify what photo he's looking at when he's discussing them?
I will have him explain, Judge, what we're looking at. That's going to probably be the way we'll be able to do that.
Judge, would you like me to just mention the number and then talk about the photo?
Yes, that would be helpful. So
Yes, Your
the
Honor.
record's clear what he's actually referring to.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Downs, so you had talked about hemorrhage, what appears to be on her right shoulder area. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, injury to the right shoulder area that you pointed out on what would be photographs number 269 and 275, is that consistent with strangulation or another applied force?
Has nothing to do with strangulation whatsoever. Completely different location. Could have happened with a forceful compression, for example, grabbing somebody by the shoulders, because I believe there are bleeds on both shoulders. But grabbing somebody there, punching somebody there, but you're not going to strangle somebody to death by grabbing their shoulder. That strangulation force is to the neck.
And so how is this type of injury caused?
Again, a punch could cause this, forcefully grabbing someone, if I could demonstrate.
If that would assist, yes, in explaining.
You want me to be your
No, may I step down? No, Your Honor, I would never.
Okay, very good. Just checking. Yeah, go ahead and step down.
Thank you.
I wasn't sure why you were looking at me, doctor.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
You wouldn't be the first or last person that may have wanted to. Go ahead.
I can do it, Doctor, while she questions you for your questions.
So the question was, how does this blood get there? This bruising on the shoulders? Well, I could punch you, and that could cause it. I could grab you and squeeze forcefully. I could shake you. All of that could cause that type of injury. I think it did. I did hear a little pop on the left.
Doctor, is it also consistent with possibly grabbing and squeezing and pushing someone down to the ground?
Sure.
And so this injury is completely separate and apart from the neck injuries.
That's correct. They may have happened in the same episode. That is, in the example that I just did, I grabbed counsel by the shoulders. I would have to let go to then grab his neck. So it's could have been the same event, but two separate parts of the event.
Again, this is discussing or showing the multiple layers in the neck. And how many muscles do we have in the neck?
Oh gosh, I think there's like 10 major ones and a bunch of little ones.
And where is it that, and I'm sorry, this diagram, is it helpful in explaining where the next injury is going to be?
It is, because I've had anatomy, I studied anatomy, I teach anatomy, I do dissections, I understand where all of this stuff is. But the photographs, especially to someone who's not familiar with looking at this, quite honestly, it probably just looks like a bunch of brown stuff and yellow stuff. And so this helps me to explain better where things are.
And so the next injury around the chest area, if you can explain where we would see that or how this diagram assists you in explaining that.
Okay, so I think that if I remember, I actually have a copy of that here. Yes, I think now I have all of the different neck injuries. So if I could just use this to kind of show an overview of all the injuries on one.
Yes, if that would assist, where the sternoid, clitoid, mastoid,
right,
and the omohyoid, and the sternohyoid, yes.
Right, because it gets very confusing, and this, you can actually see all the injuries in one picture. So, there is a 2 centimeter hemorrhage on the right sternocleidomastoid in the mid portion, a 1 centimeter hemorrhage lower than that. In the sternohyoid, a 1 centimeter hemorrhage there. In the left sternocleidomastoid, 2 centimeter hemorrhage. In the left omohyoid, 3 centimeter hemorrhage. In the lower left sternocleidomastoid, a 4.5 centimeter group. Moving on, some of these muscles repeat, so the omohyoid, there would be hemorrhage here. But moving on, there's a 0.5 centimeter hemorrhage at the right lateral or side of the hyoid. There is a 1.5 centimeter hemorrhage behind the thyroid cartilage. So all the way up against the airway, there's a 1.5 centimeter hemorrhage. I may have said inches before, I apologize. I usually use inches. 1.5 centimeter on both sides on the back of that thyroid cartilage.
Do you have an opinion, or can you tell, because it's on the back side of that cartilage, whether the force was more to the front or from the back of the neck?
I believe the forces were applied from the side. That is the compression, and it's the forceful compression of that area that causes the bleed. The cartilage itself acts as a physical barrier to the blood tracking. So, in other words, the blood is going to travel along the surface of that cartilage. That's why it's kind of layered out to 1.5 centimeters on both sides.
Doctor, can you explain what part of the body we are looking at here?
This is the front of her chest at the shoulders. And I should also point out this is an autopsy photograph. That means this body is not in what we call anatomic position. That's important, especially here. Because if you look at this, it would appear her shoulders are all the way up here. She has no neck. That's not reality. The reality is, normal people, there's a space here. So the shoulders are not way up here. They're down normal position. Unfortunately, at autopsy, I can't exactly move bodies to make them be like they were in life. Bodies get stiff after they die. The tissues don't allow me to move things back to the way they were. So that becomes important, I think, later on in interpretation and why certain things are possible and certain other things aren't possible. Right here, this V is the sternocleidomastoid muscle, right and left. The right shoulder over here, we talked about the blood that you can see under the skin flap here. There's also a smaller bleed on the left shoulder.
And I'm sorry, doctor, let me stop you for a minute. The smaller bleed over on the left shoulder, could that have been caused the same way that you showed us earlier using Mr. Harmon as a demonstrative aid? That is consistent with blunt force trauma, grabbing somebody, punching someone, and is it separate and apart from the strangulation injuries?
Yes and yes. And I should also say this is picture 287.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Your Honor. I have to ingratiate myself again.
It's all right. Don't worry about it.
So the sternocleidomastoid on the right, there's a visible hemorrhage on the medial or the midline side of that. And a second discoloration that I'm indicating on the right lower sternocleidomastoid muscle.
And are this hemorrhage here in this area, is it caused by the backup of the vein, or is it caused by the force being applied?
This is caused by crushing the blood vessels. Whatever would cause a regular bruise, cause that. Be that a punch, a blow with an object, forcefully grabbing somebody to the point that you cause them to bruise. Any of that could have caused both of those. But that's not the same as strangulation. Completely different process.
Moving on to slide number 37. This appears to be a close-up of the front chest area that we just looked at in slide number 36.
Picture 289 has that V. There's a 2-inch or 2 centimeter, bleed on the inside of the right sternocleidomastoid and a 1 centimeter bleed below in the front of the right sternocleidomastoid. Picture 292 shows you a close-up of the bleeding on the inside of that picture that we saw earlier in 289. In addition, there's a blood vessel extending vertically that you can see in both. Now, for me as a pathologist, that blood vessel is important because one of the things I want to make sure, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, I want to make sure I don't have any artifact, anything that I am possibly could be mistaken for an injury that's just decompositional or a postmortem finding. One of the things we are concerned about is how sure we are about the blood in the neck. And you might have blood pigment leaching or leaking out into the soft tissues. There's no discoloration of that kind associated with that blood vessel, which is precisely in the area where this is a concern. So I'm very confident that every time I see blood in the neck, it's real. It's not an artifact. It occurred as a result of strangulation.
Moving on to slide number 38.
This is 293. This is that basically cutting into the bleeds that we looked at the last slide, showing the extent of the bleed there.
And is that in fact confirmed that it is in fact a bleed and not something else?
Yes,
And does it confirm that it is an injury?
it is an injury. It's a fairly significant injury, close to an inch long in that location, which is inside the muscle. It's a kind of an unusual area to get to because it's inside that big muscle that runs on the side of the neck.
And this injury, is it consistent with manual strangulation?
Yes.
Moving on to slide number 39.
So this part of the dissection is where the muscles are individually being lifted up and examined. This is picture number 298, and this is part of that layered neck dissection. You can see the extensive area of hemorrhage that's on the back side of the left side of the neck.
And what area? Is this still the sternocleidoid mastoid area, or is there a separate area?
I believe it is the sternocleidomastoid. It's down. Remember, the muscles have been flipped up, so this is actually lower than it appears because just like that skin flap was flipped up, the muscles here have been flipped up.
Slide number 40.
Same area showing extensive bleeding into the musculature as well as bleeding, it looks like, into the omohyoid muscle, which runs from the shoulder, the omo, to the hyoid bone.
Again, is this area contained within the victim's neck?
Yes. Now, again, you can see the blood here. That's much higher than the level of the blood down here. So the sternocleidomastoid blood is lower. It's still well above the collarbone, but it's lower in the neck.
Is that still consistent, though, with manual strangulation, or do you think it's caused by another impact?
I think all of these are consistent with manual strangulation. If you think about a 9-year-old's neck, there's not a lot of surface area that an adult male like myself could get my hand into to wrap around. And especially if I'm using two hands, fat fingers, I'm going to cause damage to a broad area.
Could a child cause injuries such as these that we've been discussing?
What kind of child? Size?
A young child under the age of 10.
Theoretically possible. I couldn't discount it. Theoretically, I guess it would be possible.
Okay. Now, when... let's move to the next slide. I apologize. Looking at slide number 41, can you explain, are we still looking at the sternocleidoid mastoid area or a separate area?
This is a separate area. These appear to be the sternohyoid muscles that are reflected up in picture 304. Of note here, the thyroid gland is visible here in the neck. And you can see that thyroid gland actually comes up. The thyroid gland sits on top of the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple. And immediately above that level is the hyoid. So that's actually pretty high up in the neck. If you kind of just look at it, that would be roughly where the bottom of the muscles to the jaw go. This muscle is actually called the mylo, for jawbone, hyoid. So this is all the way up, even with the mandible, the jawbone.
Now, you pointed out injuries very high up on the neck and then further down the neck. Is that consistent with this force being applied and her moving around, struggling?
Oh, yes, definitely. And I should also point out that if a victim struggles, moves around, and they're able to get the assailant's grip released, then what happens is, because the tissue has been deprived of oxygen, you'll get weakened tissues. Then you have the blood that's been trying to go somewhere. They can't go anywhere. Suddenly, It's like you turn the spigot on. So all this blood comes pushing in there into weak tissue. So it causes more extensive bleeding than otherwise. So yeah, if the victim is struggling, you would expect to see more hemorrhage than you would see in other types of cases, rather than somebody, say, getting a death grip, if you will, holding it and not letting go, be it one hand or two.
And you've commented that in this case, you did see a significant amount of hemorrhage or blood. So is it consistent with the fact that there was a hold or compression for a period of time, a release, and a second pressure applied or compression to the neck?
Yes, I should point out, though, when we say release, I don't mean that they necessarily let their hand move, but the compression of the veins could be relaxed so that blood came in.
So the 5 or 6 pound force that was being applied was lightened at some point and
Correct.
then reapplied.
Correct.
Looking at slide number 42, can you explain what we are looking at here?
This is picture 309. This is now all the neck structures have been removed from the tongue all the way down to the lungs. The spine is in the midline, and you can see these lines, horizontal lines in the middle. That's actually the spinal column, the disc faces and vertebra in the middle. The collarbones, the inside of the collarbones, are visible on the sides of the picture. What this picture is showing is a pretty significant area of bleeding in the muscle that's right up against the spine. That muscle is called the longus colli muscle, and it runs literally right on top of the bone.
Is this part of the longus colli deeper within the body than the prior areas that we've been discussing, such as the sternocleidoid mastoid and the sternohyoid? Is this longus colli deeper in the body?
Yes, if you remember the picture, the schematic where I said cut my head off and we're looking straight down, and I showed you the trachea as a V-shaped, and then behind that was the esophagus, and then behind that was the spine. This blood is right up against the spine in that picture. So it's all the way in the deepest compartment or deepest segment of the anterior neck or the front of the neck. It's as deep as you can go without being in the bone.
And it's next to the cervical spine?
Yes.
How is this injury, or how does it correlate to the other injuries with respect to your opinion regarding whether there was one time of compression or there were two different times of compression applied?
This would be, I would say, more consistent with two types of compression. I think this injury is probably from her struggling, because it's so deep. It's not an area that you can compress simply mechanically. Your collarbone is right here. You can't squeeze behind the collarbone. It's bone. You've got all that rib that's holding it up. It's like structurally it's stuck in place. So there's no way to cause that area by crushing this area. It just doesn't work that way. It's physically blocked. It's like trying to cause something to that door. This column's in the way. I can't get to the door. The column's in the way. So there's no way that was a compressional injury. That's caused from her struggling, I believe.
Doctor, the photo number on the last one.
I'm sorry.
309. I'm sorry if I didn't say that already.
Moving on to slide 43. This is an anatomy diagram, and is this going to assist in explaining the next injuries that you noted to the hyoid?
Yes, it is.
Can you explain where the hyoid is?
The hyoid is, again, a horseshoe-shaped cartilage structure that, as we get older, turns to bone. That sits on top of the cartilage that makes up the Adam's apple. So, on the left side, you can see labeled thyroid cartilage. There's two big wings that stick off of that. The Adam's apple is right in the middle of those two wings. And then behind that, you have areas that are sticking up. Those are called the superior horns of the thyroid cartilage. The hyoid also has horns, but it has greater horns and lesser horns. Now, as it happens, right where the right superior horn of the thyroid cartilage meets the greater horn of the right hyoid is an area of bleeding.
Moving on to slide number 44 that contains photographs 321 and 323. Is this the Felicia Williams hyoid?
That's correct.
Can you point to where the hemorrhage is?
Sure. 321 on the upper, what would be her right, all the way at the back of the greater horn of that U. So right at the top right side of that U, you can see that dark discoloration, the bleeding. 323 is a close-up of that same area, showing that isolated bleeding deep within her neck, right up against her airway.
And is this injury consistent with manual strangulation?
Very much so, yes.
Counsel, what slide is it?
That was slide 44.
No, photo number or
Or-
slide number?
I'm including both slide, Judge, for the record, as well as photo numbers.
Okay, come on here real quick. Everybody. Have a seat, guys.
Thank you.
Doctor, moving on to the next set of photographs, can you explain what body part this is that we are looking at and
In
what
pic-
photo number they are?
Picture 324 has the airway with the attached muscles that have been removed from the body. So as part of doing the autopsy, as I mentioned, all of those neck structures from the tongue all the way down to where the airway splits to the lungs is going to be removed. In 324, that's what we're looking at. The right lung would be on the right, as my hand is indicating at the lower right corner. Left lung would be on the opposite side. The airway has been opened all the way from there, all the way up to the larynx, to the thyroid cartilage. And that's this vertical line that's extending all the way down the length of the specimen. The various muscle layers that we've talked about, the ones that didn't remain in the body, that are still attached, have been removed, and that's what's trailing off the sides of this photo. But the area of interest here that we haven't already talked about is picture 326, which is a close-up of the back side of the thyroid cartilage that's been opened up. And here you can see the greater horn, as I'm indicating in the anatomic drawing, of the thyroid cartilage. If you come down below that, inside, there is a significant bleed, 1.5 centimeters, in that muscle, the cricoarytenoid. And that's actually present on both sides.
Is this hemorrhage consistent with manual strangulation?
Highly.
Moving on to the next slide, picture photograph number 328. Can you explain what we're looking at here?
328 is the photograph. That's the same area that we just looked at. Now it's opened up and it's turned a little straighter. So we're looking from the back to the front. The area that we just looked at in the prior slide, the hemorrhage I'm indicating with my finger, and on the left side, another 1.5 centimeter bleed to that same area, as well as the bleeds on the surface of the mucosa that we discussed earlier.
Consistent with manual strangulation?
Again, highly.
Is it fair to say there are numerous injuries that are telltale signs of manual strangulation found on Felicia Williams' body?
There are multiple, to be honest, I lost count, but roughly 8, 10, something like that, individual bleeds in the neck structures through all the layers of the neck musculature from superficial to deep that are very consistent with manual strangulation.
Moving on to the temporalis muscles and the injuries that you noted there, can you explain what side of the body we are looking at and where the injury or hemorrhage is noted?
356 is looking at the right side of the skull. 355 is looking at the left side of the skull. And the insert, the anatomic diagram, is just to remind you of the location that we're looking at because it's not really obvious from the photographs. And the muscle has been incised in 356, showing the bleeding on that side, as well as 355 on the left side, showing the bleeding there.
And again, as you stated previously, we don't know why, but this is a symptom or a result of manual strangulation.
Yes, it's highly associated with manual strangulation.
Now, you noted previously internally there was an injury to the scalp. Can you explain where on the scalp and where in photograph 352 that we see this injury?
Yeah, so in order to help orient you, the anatomic model on the right is a skull. And if you look closely, you'll see a line that looks like an upside down C that's open on the bottom. That's the suture on the top of the head where the joints, the bones in the skull form joints. Then there's another suture that goes in the midline of the body all the way back through the skull. So you've got one suture here and one suture that runs in the midline. If you look at 352, you'll see the same joints or sutures that come through. What's happened here is just like before, but we approach it a little differently. We make an incision between the ears and the back of the head, dissect underneath the scalp. We take the whole scalp and flip it forward. So what you're looking at in 352 would be the top front of Felicia's head with her scalp flipped down so it's covering her face. On the right side of her forehead, underneath the skin surface and in the scalp, is a large area of bleeding. There's a second area over on the left side. The muscle, the temporalis muscle, is visible on both sides of this photograph as well.
Now, back when we saw the external photographs of Felicia Williams and we were talking about artifact, there was a portion on the front part of her head that at that time you could not in fact determine whether or not it was an injury. It was the big red marking on the forehead. You weren't sure if it was caused by the rocks or if it was in fact injury. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now that the incision has been made and the scalp has been flipped forward, do you have an opinion as to what we originally saw externally as to her forehead?
Well, there's two things going on here. There's obvious couple of episodes of blunt force here. That is, some blow to that area of her head. The problem is, given the extensive area of artifact where the skin was rubbed away and where the oysters, rocks, barnacles had gouged her skin, that could happen over the top of an existing injury. So it could just be a coincidence that you have this large open wound over that. It could also be that there's an open wound there from a blow. Based on the circumstances of this case, I don't feel comfortable telling you with certainty that this is an injury. That's a judgment that I can only tell you I can't distinguish between the two, so I'm not going to tell you something that I don't believe to be a fact.
Let's say this was injury. Is it related in any way to strangulation?
They could have been different events within the same episode. That is, for example, you pop somebody with a 2x4, then you strangle them. So in that sense, it could be part of the process, but hitting somebody with a 2x4 isn't strangling them. It's two different events.
And if it was an injury, is this consistent with blunt force trauma?
Yes. Oh, and the blood here, don't get me wrong, there is an injury here. no question. The question is whether or not that injury broke the skin. It's only that point that I have a question about. This is clearly a premortem, she's alive injury. She got a significant blow to the head here. My only question is whether or not that blow caused the open wound over the top of this blood. That's why I'm saying it could be a coincidence. An oyster could have gouged her, and it just happened to gouge her right where that existing blood was. That could happen. I'm not telling you that did happen. I'm not telling you it didn't happen. What I am telling you is she got a pop to the head over her right eye.
A slap, a punch.
By pop, I mean some type of blunt force injury, and significant enough to leave a fairly significant bruise in her scalp.
And when we say blunt force injury, what are different things that are blunt force injury, that can cause blunt force injury?
2x4, a punch, a slap, forceful grab, anything of that nature, a fall to that site.
Moving on to the tongue. Can you explain how the tongue is dissected and examined in an autopsy?
So what happens is, again, through that same incision in the front of the chest, the skin's flipped up. We come underneath that skin flap that's now sitting over the face, and with the scalpel, dissect inside the jawbone, pull the tongue down through that same opening, and then dissect it out so it comes out from below, attached to the airway. Here, the airway has been cut away to just look at the tongue, and this appears to be serially sectioned from the tip to the base of the tongue, just from top to bottom, just slice, 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 slice through the tissue to see what the tissue of the tongue itself looks like.
And can you, where is the hemorrhage documented in this photograph?
So 312 is our photo. The tip would be to our left, and in the middle there's a bleed there, and another bleed. It looks like the second section back. There's a little glare in the photograph over the site, but if you get close enough, you can see a dark area there.
And is that in the third dissection from the left in this photograph?
That's correct. And it looks like it might be also carried on to the fourth as well.
And how is it that this injury can occur during manual strangulation?
We talked about this a little bit. It could be simply from the victim struggling, the victim biting her tongue. She also could have been punched in the mouth, and that would cause her to bite her tongue. I can't tell you exactly which of those scenarios happened, if any of them, but something caused a forceful compression of her tongue to the point where she bit her tongue.
And these are consistent, could be a result of either manual strangulation or blunt force trauma?
This would be a separate event within the same episode. That is, this is not from manual hands compressing the neck. If she might have bit her tongue as a result of that, but this didn't happen from just someone grabbing her neck and squeezing it.
Moving on to the back injury, can you explain what we're looking in the two photographs documented on this slide?
359 is an overview of her back. You can see her shoulders, and it looks like the medical examiner has done the same thing here. That is, dissected a flap of skin up and then flipped that up. So the skin flap here is covering the back of her head. And then serially sectioned across the soft tissues of the back, looking for any injuries. That's in 359. 360 is a close-up right in the middle. And in there you can see the bleeding, the hemorrhage that the medical examiner found at autopsy.
And then is that in photograph 360?
Yes.
Now, are these injuries related in any way to manual strangulation or caused by a different kind of applied force?
This, again, could be a separate event within the same episode, but not from compressing the neck. This didn't happen from manual strangulation, but it might have happened while she was being manually strangled. She could have been hit with something. She could have hit the ground. She could have been struggling and hit her back on something. Any of those are reasonable possibilities.
Is this injury consistent with some kind of blunt force trauma?
Yes.
Now moving to the genital area, which this injury was observed both externally as well as internally. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Doctor, can you explain and orient us what we were looking at in photograph 001?
This is looking at the genital area, the opening to the vagina. The gloved hands are spreading the legs apart and opening the labia so that you can look down into this recessed area. Normally, the skin on both sides would be next to each other because it's up well within the protected area of the genitals. And what I'm indicating in the center are two defects in the skin that are being demonstrated in the photograph.
When you say defects, have you opined whether or not these are in fact injury or artifact?
Well, you can't have an artifactual injury. An injury just means there's something there. These are injuries, but they're not artifact.
Do you see artifact within this photograph?
Yes, quite a bit.
Okay, can you please point to it?
Starting at the inside of the left thigh, coming up, stopping at the thumb or below the area of the thumb on the inside of the left thigh. Next to the left forefinger, looks like there may be another little one at the edge of the photograph on the right side. Then coming up on the mons, which is the mound of the pubic bone where the pubic hair would be. That is visible in the center of the photograph. You can see similar types of incision/abrasion defects scattered along that area, going to the right inguinal crease, coming out a little higher on the body above the right thigh, across the abdomen, and then on up higher onto the chest area.
Going to the next slide, there's two photographs documented. Both mark 3. Is one a close-up? Is the one on the right that we're looking at a close-up?
Yes. When I was doing the PowerPoint, I was working with the native photographs, and the reason I like to do that is because sometimes you can see something in a photograph, and if I have the original picture, I can zoom in, and I don't lose quality of the picture. That's what I did here. It's like I took a magnifying glass and put it on a hard copy picture.
Looking at the photograph on our left, is there any artifact anywhere surrounding the injury to the vagina?
I don't see any at all.
Is it accurate or fair to say that it appears that these gloved hands are actually having to pull the skin apart to show this area or the injury?
Yes, and actually, if you look at the left side where the labia is coming together, you can actually see that skin is folded over. There's a crease here where that skin is pulled so far apart that it's actually folded over.
Do you have an opinion as to whether this area is considered protected or would have been protected from the elements within the water the location she was found in?
It's relatively protected in that in normal position, everything there is going to be together. Even when you spread your legs, your labia don't gape open. As demonstrated in the photograph, at autopsy, where the legs are spread apart for the purposes of the photograph, they're still having to spread manually with their fingers the labia to get this photograph. So it's a pretty protected area, pretty isolated.
Can you describe what part of the genitalia that injury is observed?
Well, there's actually two injuries. I'll deal with the first one, which is to her right, our left. That proceeds up right at the opening to the vagina, and across the hymenal area, actually into the very superficial entrance to the vagina. So it actually crosses the hymenal area.
So you see injury leading into the vagina.
Correct.
And that is one injury that you just pointed out, correct?
That's
the
correct.
higher of the two?
Yes.
And can you point to the second injury that you observe in her genitalia?
The second is below that and to her left, which would be our right as we're looking at it. A kind of crescent-shaped, if you will, area.
Can you explain how these injuries can occur?
Basically, these appear to be lacerations. That is another type of blunt force injury. There's three types. I think we've talked about bruising or a contusion, abrasion, which is that scraping away of the skin surface. The third type of blunt force is a laceration. That's a physical ripping of the skin where the surface is torn. That can happen from a blow with a 2x4, for example. If you swing a 2x4 with enough force, it can rip the skin. Another way that same type of injury can happen is a stretching injury. That is, for example, with genitals, if something is too large to fit the space, it can cause an overstretch injury and a physical ripping of that area of the skin.
Could this injury have been caused by a penis?
Yes.
Could it have been caused by fingers?
Yes.
Could it have been caused by a sexual toy?
Yes.
Is this injury consistent as being an inflicted injury?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not this injury was in fact inflicted when she was alive or dead?
I do.
And what is that?
I believe she was alive.
And why is it that you believe she was alive when this injury was inflicted?
Well, there's visible discoloration, the pink discoloration, which I noticed looking at the 003 on the left. There's a little pinkish discoloration visible, which is actually what led me to blow it up, and I think it's more visible in the enlargement. That discoloration is consistent with bleeding of somebody who's been submerged in water.
When you say that it's consistent with someone, well, first of all, the fact that there is hemorrhage there, is that indicative of determining whether or not someone was alive or dead when this injury was inflicted?
That's part of my process for it, yes, ma'am.
If the person was dead when the injury was inflicted, would you typically not see any hemorrhage there?
Well, see, this is where this case gets a little different from the garden variety case, because here the submersion of her body is very important, and an experienced pathologist would know that. When we have an injury and we're placed in a watery environment, shortly after the injury occurs, the blood will leak out into the water because there's a whole lot more water out there than there is blood in the body. So basically it dilutes everything. So I wouldn't be surprised to have an unexperienced pathologist look at this and think it was post-mortem. Or maybe they couldn't tell because they just don't have the experience. But I look at that, and I've spent 30 plus years in forensic pathology. Save 4 years of that, everything was on the coast. I've seen injuries like this before. I've seen bodies submerged in water. My opinion is that's not an artifact, that's a real injury.
So have you had training experience where there have been cases that someone has been submerged in water and something could look like artifact when in fact it's an injury?
Yes.
Dr. Downs, I'm approaching with what's been identified as State's Exhibit K-A1. Do you recognize this photograph?
Yes, ma'am.
And is it a close-up, or how is it that you recognize it?
This appears to be the same area we were just discussing. I don't know if this is my blow-up, but it's the same area. It appears to be the same photograph that we just talked about.
And fairly accurately depicting the hemorrhage and the close-up of that hemorrhage area as well as the injury going into the vagina that we just discussed?
Yes.
State offers an evidence State's Exhibit K-A1.
Any objection to KA1?
Dr. Wall, defense counsel, is looking through those photographs. Can you tell us, is there a time or amount of time that this compression must be applied in order to render someone unconscious or then kill them?
Yes, there are actually two different times involved. Estimated 10 to 15 seconds of compression of the vein will cause someone to become unconscious. So that pressure has to be continuously held in place at that site, occluding the vein, so no blood's coming back out of it, for 10 to 15 seconds, during which time the person is conscious, they're aware of what's going on, they can react to what's going on. Once they're unconscious, after that 10 to 15 seconds, the same force has to be applied continuously for at least a couple of minutes. Now, it depends on the activity level of the victim. If someone is, say, running a marathon, all right, they're going to need more oxygen, so they probably would succumb on the quicker end of things. But generally, a couple of minutes is the best estimate I can give you, and that's a minimum. Could be longer than that. And also, the person who's grabbing the neck may let go. If they let go, the clock resets. 10 to 15 seconds to unconsciousness, unbroken, continuous. Another couple of minutes continuous, unbroken, to death.
Based upon your findings and the amount of hemorrhage that you noted or observed within Miss Williams' body, do you have an opinion as to whether or not there was one straight 10 to 15 second compression or whether there was more than one?
There's indication that we talked about with her neck, specifically the longus colli, the muscle that's up against the spine. So that looks to me like she did struggle. I can't tell you that she struggled effectively to break that grip. So I can only tell you that 10, 15 seconds at least to unconsciousness, plus continuous and unbroken, another couple of minutes. Could it be longer? Could it be multiple episodes? Sure.